Welcome to Notorious Minds, where we examine those that have altered destinies and changed human history by M.R. Parks. If you have not done so already, please consider subscribing to this channel. Warning: the following video contains violent content, graphic images, and descriptions which may be considered disturbing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. Today we are examining the life of Henry Louis Wallace, the Charlotte Strangler. From 1993 through 1994, the lives of 11 Charlotte women would be destroyed, and the community in Charlotte would be outraged at the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department and their lackadaisical attention to these crimes. Henry Louis Wallace is the first known African-American serial killer. He is just as lethal as Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, or Jeffrey Dahmer, but he is the least recorded serial killer among them. So, let's start at the beginning.
Henry Louis Wallace was born on November 4, 1965 in Barnwell, South Carolina. He is 58 years old. Yes, dear old Henry is alive and well and living in North Carolina. He was born to single mother Lottie Mae Wallace. His mother grew up resentful over her life, her own beloved mother having died young and her father having deserted the family shortly thereafter. Her resentment of life did not improve when she gave birth out of wedlock to 2 children. The first child was Yvonne, and then came little Henry. Lottie Mae unwisely had a relationship with a married man. Lottie Mae is special in her own right because Henry Louis Wallace grew up with a very neglectful mother. In fact, she was verbally, physically, and psychologically abusive to her young son. She was very strict and had little patience for her children, even at a young age. His father was a married school teacher who left Lottie Mae after finding out that she was pregnant with Henry. Clearly, Henry's father already had a family and didn't want another one. Now, Wallace lived with his mother, older sister Yvonne, his great-grandmother. Wallace was forced to wear his sister's hand-me-down clothes when he grew out of his own clothes. The family had very little money, despite Lottie Mae's long work hours at a textile company. Like I said, Henry had one sister and her name was Yvonne. She was about 3 years older than Henry. The house that they lived in had no electricity and no running water, so Henry lived a pretty impoverished life. Lottie Mae was very mentally and physically abusive toward her son for the least of mistakes. Wallace's mother sought to control her son through violence, emotional abuse, and other inappropriate means. Aside from a lack of emotional comfort, the house in which Wallace grew up in was horrible. They drank from a pump well outside, and their bathroom was really a watershed with a set of chamber pots. Tensions ran high between mother and great-grandmother. The adults did not get along and argued incessantly. Henry will say that potty training for him was his first knowledge of hell. As a toddler, if he had an accident in his trousers, he was berated. The chastisement filled little Henry with such terror that he would often go in his pants, then try to hide his mistakes by concealing his soiled trousers. Because the mother was the sole provider in the household and had to work long days to pay for the bills, she demanded that her children grow up quickly. Her discipline was severe. Wallace never argued with his elders about this matter or any other, even when he was forced to wear his sister's hand-me-downs or empty the family's chamber pots, which was his daily chore. Henry yearned to be like his friends at John F. Myers Elementary School. These kids had dads with whom to play stickball, fly kites, but little Henry had no dad. When he once asked his mother about his natural father, who he was, where did he go, his mother told him to quit dreaming. Henry Louis Wallace's mother never showed him any love. She resented him. Henry always tried to win his mother's love, but he always was rejected. He was terrified of his own mother and her vicious beatings. Her hostility toward Henry was obviously due to his father leaving while she was pregnant with him. So she took out her bitterness on little old Henry. When Wallace and his sister Yvonne got in trouble, his mother used to make them go out in the yard and get the switches off of trees. For those who do not know, you might be saying, what is a switch? A switch is like a whip. Apparently, the use of a switch is either a southern phenomenon or a black one. But regardless of its origins, once you experience it, you will never forget it. Believe me, I know personally. A switch is essentially a very thin branch of something similar to a weeping willow tree or other such plants. Typically, a switch is lashed against your butt or your thighs a few times. It leaves some welt, and if you're very bad, it might break the skin. Also, the thinner the switch, the worse it is. So your mother, aunt, or grandmother would make the child go out and get the switch off the tree, which is psychological torture at its finest for the would-be victim. Seriously, you know you don't want to go pick the thinnest one out there, but God help you if your mom or your grandma think it is too thick. If you pick one that is too thick, they're going to go out there and bring in the whole tree. But seriously, the thinnest one on the tree they're going to get, and it's going to mean extra lashes for you. They call it child abuse now, but it definitely kept children in line. So Henry and Yvonne would go get a switch off a tree and beat each other with those switches because their mother would get home from a hard day's work and wouldn't feel like doing it. So she would make them beat each other. Wallace revealed after his arrest that he hated hitting his sister and how painful it was to have to hurt her, worse than being on the receiving end of the beatings. The nice boy next door, Henry Wallace, most neighbors thought Henry grew up like most kids in Barnwell, the second child of a tireless textile employee. Henry was allowed to play youth sports in grade school. His mother, known to many in the town of 6,000 as Lottie Mae, told friends she wanted to make a better life for her two children. And Henry's mother only showed him her bad side. So can you imagine a young boy having to walk through town with girls' clothes on, which will ultimately give credence to why Henry Louis Wallace became the man that he did, why he had such a disdain for women. When Henry was around 8 years old, he started having violent fantasies.
I think violent fantasy, it started way back when, I think I was about 8 years old. There was a whole bunch of older guys, and there was the girl, and she was probably about 16. So they took her into the woods, and I followed them into the woods. It was like 5 or 6 guys raping her. And I got turned on by it.
At 8 years old, Henry was turned on by the 16-year-old girl being gang raped. This pivotal moment in Henry's life turned him toward domination, control, rape, bondage, and an introduction into a deviant sexual predator. At 16 years of age, Wallace attempts to sexually assault his friend's younger sister, and eventually he begins to have rough sex with sex workers. Henry spent his formative years at Barnwell High School, where he served in the student council. He asked his mother could he play high school football, but she said no, so he joined the cheerleading squad as its only male cheerleader. the only male on the roster, and he towered over all his female counterparts. They were excited about him. There were shouts of admiration for him. The student and staff liked Henry. They said he was enthusiastic, how creative he was. The girl cheerleaders adored him because of his politeness and upbeat attitude. By the time Wallace got into high school, he was one of the most popular kids on the campus. As a senior, he was a member of the student council. Wallace was elected captain. In school pictures, he looks doe-eyed and innocent, which is pretty much the way classmates remember him. Few who went to Barnwell High School want to talk about Wallace now. But Principal Phil Flynn said he was a good student who worked hard to become part of the student body and was admired by his classmates. Marsha Brown, a childhood friend, said, "You remember how people look at the captain of the football team? That's what he was like." Marbia Nix, a high school friend, had known Henry since first grade. She remembered him the way most people in Barnwell who knew him do, friendly, cheerful, bright, and exceptionally well-mannered. She thought it was a little strange that he was the only boy cheerleader, though. He graduated in 1983. After graduating from Barnwell High School, Wallace made a feeble attempt to pursue higher learning. He attended South Carolina State College for a semester and then Denmark Technical College. He flunked out of both of them, not because he couldn't do the work, but because he had no motivation. He was well-liked and did decently in school despite his toxic upbringing. He married his high school sweetheart, the former Moretta Brahman, in 1987 while in college. During that time, Wallace became a DJ for a Barnwell radio station. He had more interest in his evening job as a DJ, and he was a DJ for WBAW, fashioning himself after a former DJ named Wolfman Jack, and tagged himself as a night rider. The listeners enjoyed his humor, his easygoing manner. Females liked his voice, and it may have been the roots of a good career, but Wallace was fired for stealing CDs. Bobby Nichols, sales manager and afternoon air personality at WBAW FM in Barnwell, said Wallace had started working at the station his senior year in high school. After impressing Nichols one day, he walked in and said, "I'm Henry Wallace. I love your show and I would like to work for you." Nichols was so impressed by Wallace that he would let him borrow his car to run errands. Wallace had a way of making whatever he was talking about sound interesting, and he was a great at mimicking singers, especially rap artists. After he graduated from high school, the owner of the radio station that he worked for, Drew Wilder, said that he had good manners and was respectful, and he called himself again the Night Rider because of his smooth speaking voice. It seems that Henry had sticky fingers, though. Wilder reportedly fired Wallace after he was suspected of stealing CDs at the age he was around 20 at the time. Wallace didn't seem the least bit upset when they confronted him about the tapes, and they let him go. At age 29, standing 6 feet tall and weighing about 200 pounds, Henry Louis Wallace joined the U.S. Navy in 1985. He married his high school sweetheart, Moretta Brahman, in the same year, and he also became a stepfather to Moretta's daughter. Prior to the wedding, Moretta had a child by another guy, but Wallace opened his arms to the girl. His wife and child followed Wallace as he transferred from the West Coast and back again, but the union turned out to be a disappointment. Wallace even adopted her child, and he wanted one of his own, but his wife refused to have one. This caused a strain in their marriage. Furthermore, their sex life dwindled. Her attitude and the fact that she, interestingly enough, was raped when she was a teenager. He suggested they attend counseling sessions, but she blew up in his face. The year was 1992 and the beginning of the end for their marriage. After he entered civilian life, Moretta left him. Unemployed and heartbroken, Wallace moved back in with his mother and his sister. But in better years, when he first joined the U.S. Naval shipping to recruiting training in Orlando, Florida, he would remain in the Navy for 8 years. In the Navy, Wallace was described as an outstanding seaman who willingly followed all orders, accomplished all assigned tasks in a timely manner. It was noted that his knowledge level was higher than the expected seaman. He was eventually promoted to third-class petty officer before he left the service. His achievement ranking was nearly perfect. Unfortunately, after they married, Wallace began to use drugs, crack cocaine. He would then burglarize homes and businesses in order to pay for his drugs. During this time in the Navy, he received several commendations for his performance. He was an exceptional serviceman. He turned out to be good at what he did, but in 1988, he was kicked out for committing a burglary near the naval base. He had been arrested in January of 1988 in Bremerton, Washington, charged Henry with trying to steal a VCR, a TV, and a microwave. The Army found out and they discharged him, but interestingly enough, the Navy gave him an honorable discharge, probably because of his exemplary record. While he was in Washington State, he was served with several warrants for his burglaries in the Seattle metro area. In January of 1988, he was arrested for breaking into a hardware store. That June, he pleaded guilty to second-degree burglary, and the judge, being lenient on him, sentenced him to 2 years of supervised probation. I believe the judge was lenient on him because Wallace was a former serviceman. He did not show up for most of his mandatory meetings with his probation officer. According to some, it is believed that Wallace committed his first successful sexual assault in 1987 in Seattle, Washington, where he was stationed in the Navy. Sometime after this attack, he moved back to Barnwell, South Carolina, where his violent fantasies against women would escalate with his first victim there. Tashonda Bethea, affectionately known as Shan by those that loved her. She was born on February 13, 1972. She was 18 years old. Tashonda met Henry Louis Wallace in 1989. Henry had a crush on her and wanted to date her. Both of their mothers worked at the same factory and were friends, which is how they met. Wallace quickly developed a crush on her after they met, although the feelings were not mutual. But Tashonda Bethea would accept rides from him sometimes, but continually resisted his advances when Wallace wanted to have sex. Wallace would say that they would hug and they would kiss, but she wouldn't let it go any further than that. She was Henry Louis Wallace's first known victim. On March 8, 1990, Wallace murdered her. But based on Wallace's deviant behavior, there is no way I believe she is his first victim. It wasn't until several weeks later that her body was discovered on April 1st, 1990 by 2 fishermen, 2 weeks after she was reported missing. Her body was found at Anderson Pond, a scenic spot a few miles northwest of Barnwell. A few days later, police had 3 to 4 names of people she had been seen with that day, and Wallace quickly became the top suspect. The Barnwell County Sheriff's Department interrogated Wallace in Annandale, where he was being held in connection with an attempted rape of another Barnwell girl. 16-year-old Eartha Brown. They didn't have enough evidence to charge him, so they let him go. Eartha Brown, Wallace picked up Brown, an acquaintance from childhood, for a date one night in March 1990 and took her to an Annandale motel. He told her he was going to steal some TVs, she would say later. Once inside the motel, Wallace grabbed her and tried to rip off her clothes. When she resisted, he put a pistol to her head and said he was going to kill her. just like he did Shan. When Eartha screamed, he left the motel and drove her home. Eartha was so scared, Wallace spent only 8 days in an Annandale jail on the attempted rape charge. He entered a pretrial intervention program for nonviolent offenders, which he never completed. After Wallace was released, Eartha Brown said he began driving by a Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant where she worked out and would glare at her. She said Lottie Mae Wallace visited her too and cursed her out for accusing her son of rape. Eartha Brown said prosecutors never told her and her mother that Wallace would enter a nonviolent offenders program instead of going to prison. Unlike many others in Barnwell, Brown would say she is not surprised he became a serial killer. By this time, his marriage to his wife Moretta had fallen apart and they divorced in February of 1991. Wallace broke into Barnwell radio station where he stole video and recording equipment, but he was caught trying to pawn them. He spent 4 months in state prison in Annandale, South Carolina. Then in November of 1991, Wallace relocated to Charlotte, North Carolina, where he would go down in infamy. He found various jobs in and around the Charlotte area until he officially got a job as a manager at the Taco Bell near Eastland Mall. It would only take a few months after moving for him to commit his second murder. Sharon Nance was born on November 19, 1959. She was raised by her grandfather and dropped out of school when she was 15 years old. She then fell in with a bad crowd, started using drugs, and started getting in trouble from there. She also had recently been released from prison. She lived at 1315 Spring Street in Charlotte, North Carolina. She left her aunt's house on May 20th, 1992. She was wearing a black dress, saying she was going out with friends. Wallace picked up 32-year-old Nance, who was a convicted drug dealer and prostitute. Wallace had sex with Nance, and she then demanded payment for services rendered. But Wallace didn't have any money, and they got into a fight, and he beat her to death. He dumped her body by some railroad tracks. When she didn't return home or call, Aunt Linda Nance knew something was wrong, but it wasn't until a week later when TV reports showed police finding a woman's body in a black dress that the family knew how bad it was. She had been beaten and left beside Roswell's Ferry Road. The mystery of Sharon Nance's death would last for almost 2 years, and Nance's family would struggle with a mysterious, violent end to a troubled life. Despite the world labeling Sharon Nance as a prostitute, a mother as well, her son's name was Rashid. That's whom Wallace stole her from. His first 2 murders were committed a few years apart, but from here forward, Wallace escalated his violence and significantly reduced the time of wait between each attack. His next victim would be Caroline Love. On June 15, 1992, the extremely reliable Caroline Love worked at a Bojangles restaurant as a cashier, where she had been employed for 2.5 years. Caroline was born and raised in Charlotte and attended Northwest Junior High School, where she ran track. After high school, Caroline attended Garinger High School, and after graduation she enrolled in Central Piedmont Community College, where she studied nursing in September of 1981. She wanted to serve people. She would not even be labeled as a murder, in fact, for many months. No corpse was ever found. She was ultimately filed as a missing person. When Caroline did not come to work to Bojangles with her Walkman headphones over her ears, Her manager, Terry Bazakis, knew something was wrong. Whenever he worked the night shift he tried to schedule, Caroline loved to work too. She did her job, never gave him any problems, says Bazakis. Now an area manager for the fast food chain, she would do her job and not complain about it. Love was hired as a cashier at the Central Avenue Bojangles in September of 1989 and worked there until June 15, 1992. She finished her shift that day just after midnight, and she began walking home to her Darby's Terrace apartment on Central Avenue 6 blocks away. As she was walking home, her cousin Robert Ross saw her walking and gave her a ride the rest of the way. Her cousin Robert dropped her off and watched her go inside. He never saw anything suspicious, so he drove away. Before she left work, she got a roll of quarters from her manager in order to wash her laundry. Her manager, Mr. Bazakis, where Caroline worked, called Kathy Love, Caroline's sister, who also worked at Bojangles, to see if she knew where her sister might be. She hadn't shown up for work, and that's outside of Caroline's character. She always showed up for work. He asked Kathy, would you please go by and check on your sister? I think something might be wrong. So her sister goes over to Caroline's apartment, not able to find Caroline at the home or evidence of foul play. And the next day, Caroline does not show up for work again, and her boss contacts her sister one more time. This time, Kathy contacts Caroline's roommate, Sadie McKnight, and asks her had she spoken to Caroline. Kathy expressed that she also was worried about Caroline. Sadie said she hadn't spoken to her, and Caroline always tells me when she's going to be away, when she's not coming home. They go into Caroline's room, and the sheets on her bed are missing, and her furniture has been moved around. So Kathy, Sadie, and Sadie's boyfriend, Henry Louis Wallace, go to the police to express their concerns and to list her as a missing person. The police questioned the Bojangles manager and learned that the last time he saw Caroline was on the 15th of June. She gave him a $10 bill so she could get a roll of quarters because she needed to do her laundry. Investigator Tony Rice of the Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department determined her room looked suspicious. The sheets were removed from her bed and were not in the apartment. Her furniture had been moved aside and her shoes were missing. When they looked in her hamper, it was full of laundry, so she never did her laundry that she got those quarters for, and the quarters were missing as well. The police investigators looked for Caroline, but it led to a dead end, and they ultimately listed Caroline on a long list of runaways in and around Charlotte that year. She would remain missing for the next 2 years. When Caroline went missing, Sadie McKnight moved in with her boyfriend Henry Louis Wallace, whom she had been dating for 2 years. Exactly 8 months later, Wallace found his next victim. Shauna Denise Hawk was born on September 2, 1972. She was 20 years old. Shauna Hawk was living with her mother, Sylvia Denise Sumter, in Charlotte. She was the second child and only daughter of D. Sumter and Walter Hawk II. She grew up to become a very beautiful, sweet, gentle woman with so much to offer. She and her beautiful mother were very close. Mother and daughter lived alone in Charlotte after her family split up in the early 1990s. Her brothers lived with their father, a high school principal in Atlanta. Shauna and her mother lived in a house on Elon Street. Shauna graduated from East Mecklenburg High School. Shauna enrolled at Central Piedmont Community College, studying to become a paralegal. She was a very responsible young lady and worked part-time to help pay the family bills since she was 14. Lying about her age to get hired at a McDonald's, Miss D remembered how Shauna would bring her entire check to her and say, "Mommy, here, this is for meals." The entire check, when she was just a shy, unassuming student who wasn't involved in student activities. Her mother just stated she was just a basic good child. Shauna worked at Taco Bell paying for her college tuition at Central Piedmont Community College. She was studying to be a paralegal and would have been a successful lawyer as well, for she had a passion for justice, but her ambitions and dreams were cut short by Henry Louis Wallace. Wallace's charm helped him make friends easily. Beneath the charm hides a sinister side. He was once Shauna's boss at Taco Bell in East Charlotte. Shauna Hawk met her boyfriend, Daryl Kirkpatrick, on the set of Can You Help My Child? He was an actor in the drama, which focuses on awareness on drugs and violence in inner cities. Miss D. Sumter was doing publicity for the singers in the play, and Shauna used to help out with odd job. The couple had been dating just over a month before her tragic death. Shauna spent a great deal of time taking care of her godson, Jermond Williams, age 2. The small toddler loved her a lot, and they used to talk every night on the phone. Jermond's mother, Tasha Williams, and Hawk met when they both were students at East Mecklenburg High School and worked part-time at the McDonald's together. Jermond had spent the night at Shauna's house, and Hawk had planned to pick him and his mother up at the daycare at 3:00 p.m. She never came. A month before her untimely death, she was babysitting her neighbor's daughter, whose house was broken into while she was home alone one January afternoon. Shauna and her mother stepped up the plate and kept her safe in their house until her parents arrived. Her parents filed a report with the police. The police didn't follow through with the report. It turned out to be none other than Henry Louis Wallace, who took advantage of police indifference in the neighborhoods of color and who always displayed his gentlemanly demeanor in public. Shauna was an apple of her mother's eye. Her favorite color was purple, and one of her favorite songs were You Are the Sunshine of My Life by Stevie Wonder. You see, Shauna got a job at Bojangles until she obtained a better paying job at Taco Bell on Sharon Amity Road by the manager there, Henry Louis Wallace. Mr. Wallace assured Shauna's mother that she would be a good fit there, and he thought she would do well there. But one night, on Friday, the 19th of February, 1993, in Charlotte, North Carolina, on Elon Street, life was altered forever, which Miss D calls Horrible Friday. That morning, Shauna says to her mother before she leaves home, "Mom, I love you." Miss D says, "Shauna, I love you more," and Shauna leaves out the door and leaves for her day. Shauna closed the door and off she went. Later, Miss D gets a call from Shauna's friend asking Miss D, "Have you heard from Shauna? I've been trying to get in touch with her all day. I can't seem to find her anywhere." Shauna's mother said, "No, I haven't heard from Shauna." Her friend says, "I'm worried about Shauna, Miss D. I've always been able to get in touch with her." So when Miss D returns home, she notices that Shauna's car is not in front of the house like it usually is. But when Miss D goes inside the house, she notices that her daughter's purse is there, and Shauna does not go anywhere without her purse. Then Shauna's mother looks inside her closet, and she notices that Shauna's coat is in there. And on February 19th in Charlotte, North Carolina, it was 35 degrees outside, and if Shauna went anywhere, she should have taken her purse, and she definitely should have taken her coat. So Miss D calls Daryl Kirkpatrick, Shauna's boyfriend, and asks him, "Have you heard from Shauna today?" And Daryl says, "No, I've been trying to get in touch with her all day." So Shauna's mother says to Daryl, "Can you please come right over? I'm really worried about Shauna." So Daryl rushes over to Shauna's house to her mother. In the meantime, Miss D calls Shauna's job to see maybe she was called into work today. But when she talks to Shauna's job, they say no, she's not scheduled to work today. Then Miss D gets a call from Tasha, Shauna's close friend. Shauna is the godmother to her son Jermond, and tells Miss D that Shauna did not pick up her godson today, which she does every single day. So now the hairs on the back of Miss D's neck stand up. And it wasn't until she learned that Shauna failed to pick up her godson that Miss D knew something was horribly wrong. When Daryl, her boyfriend, gets there, he proceeds to go through the house looking for any evidence of where Shauna might be. Miss D proceeds to call the police to declare Shauna as a missing person. Daryl checks all the rooms in the house. Then he goes downstairs to the bathroom. He opens the door and he notices that the carpet on the floor is wet and the curtain on the tub is closed, but it's tucked halfway in and halfway out. So Daryl pulled the curtain back and screams. For when he draws the curtain back, Shauna is laying in a tub filled with water. Her face is underneath the water, and she's laying in the fetal position in the bottom of the tub. Daryl lets out a blood-curdling scream which gets Miss D's attention. Daryl runs upstairs and yells to Miss D, "Call the police!" And when the emergency personnel get there, they try to administer CPR on Shauna because she's not breathing, but it's far too late. Shauna is dead, and she is pronounced dead at the hospital. The next day, Dr. James Sullivan, a forensic pathologist and medical examiner for the county, performed an autopsy on Shauna's body. He discovered a contusion on the left side of Shauna's scalp above the ear and a laceration on the left eardrum with some hemorrhaging behind the eardrum, evidencing a blunt trauma prior to death. Dr. Sullivan indicated that based on the bruising present, the blow occurred prior to death, but that it was not likely that the blow caused unconsciousness. Dr. Sullivan also observed hemorrhages in the lining of her eyes, the conjunctiva, on the skin of the face and in the lining of the mouth, and in the muscles in the front of the neck overlying the voice box area, all which were indications of ligature strangulation. She was then placed inside the tub. Dr. Sullivan listed her cause of death as ligature strangulation. After her death, police attempted to narrow down a suspect, but despite their effort, they weren't able to. Police concluded that there was no forced entry into the house, so Shauna had to let her killer in. The killer was thorough, wiping down all prints in the house to leave no evidence that he had ever been there. It was also discovered that Shauna had been raped. Police investigations stated whoever murdered Shauna had done this before, but they had no clue who it might be. When the police finally located Shauna's missing car, it was located at Central Piedmont Community College, where Shauna goes to school. Now, who would have enough knowledge of Shauna's life to know where she lives, where she goes to school? But the police noticed something else. The seat in Shauna's car was pushed all the way back, so whoever drove her car to the college, it wasn't Shauna, for Shauna's feet would have not been able to touch the pedal. Now, Caroline Love and Shauna Hawk were friends, so now Caroline is missing and Shauna is dead. They both went to the same college, hung out together, and ultimately worked together. When Caroline first disappeared, Shauna said to her mother, "Ma, my friend Caroline is missing, and she never misses work." The next person to feel Henry's wrath would be 4 months later, it would be Audrey Spain. She was the next person to encounter Bad Henry. Audrey grew up in a tiny coastal town in South Carolina, and her parents hated seeing her move to the big city of Charlotte. But Spain hoped to find a job working with computers. She came from Bayboro, South Carolina, about 3 years earlier. Her career plan fizzled, and she ended up working at Taco Bell restaurants. There she fell in with a group of young singles who shot baskets, cooked out, and went to comedy clubs. One of them was Henry Louis Wallace. Audrey was the youngest daughter of 6 children. Her parents, Broughton and May Helen Spain of Bayboro, called her Baby and remember her as a friendly youth who knew no strangers. And her Charlotte co-workers say the same. She always liked to make you smile and laugh, said Stephanie Cook, who worked with Spain at the Sharon Amity Taco Bell. On the 23rd of June, 1993, Audrey was to report to work at 6:30 p.m. at the Taco Bell restaurant. She did not show up for work. Mark Lawrence, Spain's manager, thought it was unusual for Spain not to come to work, so he drove by Spain's apartment that evening. Lawrence saw Spain's car in the parking lot. He then called Spain and left a message on her answering machine. The next morning, the 24th of June, 1993, Lawrence rode by Spain's apartment again and saw the car still parked in the same spot in the parking lot. He knocked on the door several times with no answer. Lawrence called Spain's sister and left a message to express his concern. Audrey Spain did not show up for work that evening either. Spain's sister never returned Lawrence's call, so the manager called 911. Thereafter, officers periodically rode by the apartment and knocked on the door, but got no response. Finally, on the 25th of June, 1993, maintenance personnel from the apartment complex entered the apartment through a sliding glass door. The janitor entered Audrey Spain's apartment. His eyes fell on the open bedroom door and what looked like a naked woman sprawled across the bed. Edging closer, he knew that clay-colored, motionless body was once the vibrant tenant named Audrey, who smiled at him so warmly whenever they crossed paths. Her face was now distorted, her eyes bulged, and her entire form laid frozen while in the throes of anguish. Mr. Lawrence again stopped by Audrey Spain's apartment, and an officer informed him they discovered Spain's dead body in her apartment at 4923 Central Avenue. A few days after she was killed, a co-worker and friend, Stephanie Cook, got the news of Audrey's death from none other than Henry Louis Wallace. Henry walked up to Stephanie and said, "Guess what?" She remembers him saying, "You aren't going to believe this. Audrey is dead." Audrey's parents took her body home to Bayboro. Her friends never heard anything about her funeral. On June 26 of 1993, Dr. James Sullivan, the medical examiner, conducted an autopsy on Audrey's body. There was a ligature made from a t-shirt and a bra around her neck, with the end of the t-shirt stuffed into her mouth. After removing the ligature, Dr. Sullivan discovered a mark left by the ligature. He also observed hemorrhages in the conjunctiva, on the skin of her face, and in the voice box, and in the muscles in front of her neck. Dr. Sullivan determined that the cause of death was strangulation. Her eyes were bulging out of her head. It was discovered that Audrey had been raped and strangled just like Shauna, but at that time they did not connect the crimes. Henry goes on to turn the thermostat in her apartment down to 60 as a way of slowing down the body's decomposing process. Audrey's body had been in her apartment for at least 2 days, so young Henry seems to be getting smarter with each crime. Carolyn Love, Shauna Hawk, Audrey Spain. One missing person, 2 identical strangulations months apart. No witnesses reporting suspicious characters. No one sees the green Maxima parked outside the crime scenes. No one piecing together that it is the work of one man. No one perceiving that there is a serial killer in town. But the police have indicated that it wasn't just one detective investigating these crimes, but several. But even in that, there should have been better communication amongst colleagues, or at least a tracking system to show whether these cases are linked. And even after the 3rd victim, the police had no idea that these cases were linked together. Even though Audrey and Shauna were raped, strangled, and had worked at the same Taco Bell, 1993 would be a pivotal year for young Henry. It seems that once he got started, he couldn't stop. But even though the media would eventually call him the Charlotte Strangler or the Taco Bell Strangler, He did not fit the idea of a textbook serial killer. The way he killed would often change, and it did in the case of Valencia Jumper, born May 10, 1972 in Columbia, South Carolina. In August of 1993, Valencia, 21 years old, was a senior at John C. Smith University in Charlotte studying political science. She also worked at Food Lion on Central Avenue and Hex in South Park Mall. She was definitely a disciplined young lady. On the 9th of August 1993, a boyfriend of Jumper's, Zachary Douglas, spoke with her on the phone about meeting later that night. When Douglas did not hear from her, he went to her apartment and he smelled something burning when he arrived at Jumper's apartment in the early morning hours of August 10, 1993, and he noticed smoke coming from under her apartment door. Douglas turned the doorknob and the door was unlocked, so he opened the door. Douglas stated that there was too much smoke for him to enter the apartment any further. He then alerted a neighbor who called the fire department. As firefighters arrived on the scene to fight the fire, when they put out the fire and during the investigation, firefighter Dennis Arney entered the kitchen and noticed a fire started on the stove with a burning pot on the stove. The fire then spread throughout Valencia's bedroom where she was laying in bed. They believe she died of thermal burns, but they would be wrong. On August 10, 1993, Dr. Sullivan performed an autopsy on Valencia's body. Her body was extensively burned. Dr. Sullivan was told that the fire was thought to have been accidentally caused by a pot of beans left burning on the stove. However, he found no soot in Jumper's airway, indicating she was not breathing or inhaling smoke during the time of the fire. Dr. Sullivan did not think that was suspicious and listed thermal burns as the cause of death. How could a sleeping woman who accidentally left the stove on not inhale smoke into her lungs during a fire, when only a dead person who died before the fire started could do that, revealing another level of negligence in investigating these crimes? But Dr. Sullivan would change his report to a strangulation murder case after the true nature of these crimes was finally revealed. After Henry was caught, he went back and changed his records. In September of 1993, Michelle Stinson, age 20, lived at the Greer Apartments at 3451 Marvin Road in Charlotte with her two young sons. She was attending Central Piedmont Community College, where she was studying graphic design. She was born in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, and on September 15, 1993, Michelle's friend James Mays stopped by her apartment to visit her and her children. Mr. Mays knocked on the front door, but no one answered. And right before Mr. Mays was about to leave, he heard the children knocking on the window from inside, telling him his mother was sleeping on the kitchen floor. Mr. Mays thought they were playing a game, but Stinson still did not answer her door. So James Mays turns to leave, and the eldest child came out the back door and grabbed his hand. James picked up the child and went back into the apartment through the back door. Mr. Mays discovered Michelle Stinson laying on the kitchen floor with blood around her body. James picked up the phone but realized the cord had been cut and jerked out of the wall. He quickly took both children to the neighbor's house and called 911 from there. Wallace murdered Michelle Stinson in the presence of her children, a memory they will never forget. The autopsy, also performed by Dr. Sullivan the next day, he discovered 4 stab wounds to the left side of her back. A blade had penetrated the upper left side of her back below the shoulder blade and had caused mortal wounds to the heart and lungs. 2 of the 4 stab wounds were potentially fatal as they caused injury to both the heart and the lungs. Dr. Sullivan also noticed the same hemorrhaging in the skin as well as on the neck. He determined that her cause of death was ultimately the stab wounds, but the strangulation was a contributing factor. The way Henry murdered is different than his usual method. Up until this murder, he had not stabbed anyone. This also made it difficult for police to link the cases together. The police said there was no forced entry into Michelle's apartment, so whoever killed her, she knew them. After Michelle Stinson's murder, there would be a 5-month pause between attacks, and the police beefed up patrols in her area. Now, it was in December that Shauna Hawk's mother, Dee Sumter, started a campaign in the media to bring attention to the death of her daughter, Shauna. It was a mother's love that would not allow for her daughter's killer to remain free. She started an organization in Charlotte called Mothers Against Dead Offspring. She was appalled at the lack of attention the police were giving in the death of her daughter.
Here all along. It's been right here, and they've done everything except look right here.
For remember, Caroline was a friend of Shauna's, so she knew something was up, and she refused to allow the police to do nothing. She told the world through her interviews that she believed that if these women were Caucasian, it wouldn't have gone this far. They would have found something. She turned the heat up on the police department, and she would write a letter in the local newspaper to her daughter's killer, which said, "Please, please, please come forward and turn yourself into the authorities so that justice can be served, so that you can get the help that you need, and so that forgiveness can be given. For without it, you're desperately, eternally doomed." And that is the end of 1993. Henry made his way to his next victim. On February of 1994, 1 year after Shauna Hawk had been murdered and a day after her mother goes on the news to bring attention to her daughter's killer, Wallace raped and strangled. Vanessa Little Mack was born on July 1st, 1968. She was in the prime of her life at a mere 25 years old, and in February of 1994, Vanessa Mack was living in an apartment on Greenland Avenue in Charlotte with her 2 young daughters and worked at the Carolinas Medical Center. Beautiful, smart, bright-eyed, she left behind 2 young daughters, Natara and little Natalia, who was only 4 months old at the time of her death. On the day of February 20th, 1994, her daughter's grandmother, Barbara Rippey, went to Vanessa's apartment to pick up Mac's youngest daughter, as she did every Sunday morning so Mac could go to work. Rippey arrived at 6 a.m. She went to the back door, but the door was ajar. Barbara Rippey knew something was wrong the instant she spotted the open door. Vanessa Mack's apartment off of Wilkinson Boulevard was always locked tight. Each time Grandma Rippey visited, she'd knock, then wait. Eventually, Mac would come to the kitchen window first, checking once, twice, even 3 times before she let Rippey in. In February of 1994, Mac had reason for caution. At 25, she was a single mother struggling to raise 2 young daughters in a city that no longer felt safe. For the better part of a decade, crack cocaine had been streaming into Charlotte neighborhoods. Days before Vanessa Mack was strangled by Charlotte serial killer Henry Louis Wallace, she asked Barbara Rippey to raise her daughters if anything happened to her. Coincidence? I think not. Rippey also knew that Vanessa Mack feared something else. For weeks, the young woman had been tormented by the same nightmare, a desperate, night-long race to escape the devil. When she'd awaken, Vanessa Mack would find herself gasping for air as if the chase had crossed over into waking life. I think God was trying to give her a message, and something or someone was closing in on her. Rippey, then 54, had raised 6 children of her own, but she had ties to Mac's 2 girls. Natara, 7, whose father was Rippey's son, often stayed at Rippey's house in Pineville. Miss Rippey also looked after 4-month-old Natalia when Mac worked as a patient's aide at the Carolinas Medical Center. Rippey was so involved with the girls' care that it made it easier for her to envision them as her own. Nonetheless, she well understood the significance of what she was being asked to do. A little before 6 a.m., on February 20th, 1994, Rippey stood on Mac's back stoop. She paused, then pushed through the open door into the darkened apartment. Mac's keys, attached to a fob decorated with her daughter's photographs, dangled from the inside lock. Grandma Rippey called out Vanessa Mac's name. No answer. She found her way across the kitchen, talking louder as she went, and flipped on the overhead light. "Vanessa, wake your ass up," Grandma Rippey remembered saying in a near shout. "You're going to be late." Still no reply. Then she saw Natalia. The baby was lying on her stomach on the sofa, not in the crib kept in her mother's bedroom, but on the living room sofa. The baby propped herself up with her arms and was smiling, still in her play clothes from the day before, which Grandma Rippey felt was unusual. Natara, Mac's other daughter, was already at Rippey's home in Pineville, still asleep. Grandma Rippey went to see if Vanessa was awake. Confused and more alarmed, Grandma Rippey walked toward Mac's bedroom, and when she went into her bedroom, she called out to her because the room was dark. Vanessa did not move. She reached in and found a light switch. Mac's body was spread across her bed. A pillowcase was tied around her neck, along with another piece of fabric. Mac had been strangled with her daughter's baby blanket. Trembling, Grandma Rippey retraced her steps through the living room. She picked up the baby, dialed 911, and then made her way to a nearby parking lot as the wall of approaching police sirens continued to build. Grandma cradled Natalia, the 2 of them already bound by a promise Grandma Rippey never imagined she would have to keep. Fire department and the police department vehicles arrived. Officer Jerry Bumgarner of the Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department found her laying on her bed. Officer Bumgarner observed Vanessa with a pillowcase tied around her neck, blood dripping from her nose, ears, and the back of her head. Vanessa Mac's death was particularly vicious. Henry Louis Wallace took his time with her. He would start strangling her, then he would loosen up and strangle her again. When the detectives went in and found her body, her face was blood red from petechial hemorrhaging. The blood vessels underneath her skin had burst for fighting for oxygen. Her pocketbook with its contents of it scattered around the bed. Dr. Sullivan performed the autopsy on her body on February 21st of 1994. The autopsy, Vanessa Mac had been raped before she was strangled, but Vanessa also had minor blunt force trauma. The ligature around her neck was made up of a long-sleeve pullover shirt and the baby's blanket, and her cause of death was also labeled as ligature strangulation. Dr. Sullivan also observed small hemorrhages in the conjunctiva, on the skin of the face, and in the muscles in the front of the neck. He also observed small areas of bruising beneath the ligature, likely caused by the pinching of the ligature against her skin. Within days, police told Grandma Rippey that the killer tried to use Vanessa Mac's bank card at a nearby ATM but failed. Grandma Rippey had always told Vanessa Mac to keep her pen secret. Mac had listened to Grandma and given her attacker the wrong number. At Mac's apartment, detectives found no fingerprints or signs of a forced entry. At first, police focused their investigation on Mac's former boyfriend, who failed 2 lie detector tests, but he was never charged. 2 weeks passed, and the search for Mac's killer began to go cold. During the second week of March 1994, there were 3 murders within 3 days. It seemed as though Wallace began to grow impatient with spacing each attack out and carelessly abandoned his usual precautions of making sure to clean everything up thoroughly. Betty Jean Baucom. In March of 1994, Ms. Baucom lived in an apartment in Charlotte with her 3-year-old adopted daughter. On the 9th of March 1994, Betty Jean, an assistant manager at the Bojangles restaurant on Central Avenue, she was scheduled to work but didn't report to work. Betty Jean's unit director, Jeffrey Ellis, called her apartment several times but received no answer. Mr. Ellis also talked with some of Betty Jean's co-workers, but no one had heard from her. The next morning, Mr. Ellis began increasingly worried because Betty Jean was scheduled to work but did not report. Mr. Ellis also called Betty Jean's mother and aunt, but neither Betty Jean's mother or her aunt had heard from her. Mr. Ellis and another employee drove to Betty Jean's apartment to check on her. They knocked on the door and looked in the windows, and everything appeared normal. Mr. Ellis then called Baucom's mother again. Mr. Ellis and her mother decided to contact the police department, and they reported Betty Jean as a missing person. Now, where Betty Jean worked at was the same store that Caroline Love worked at. So since Caroline was still missing and the manager was on high alert about the employees, Mr. Ellis, knowing Betty Jean Baucom, she was an exceptional employee. She would never be a no-show, no-call at work. So he knew that something was wrong. It was outside of Betty Jean's character for her just not to show up. She was that reliable. So Mr. Ellis calls the police to do a welfare check on Betty Jean Baucom. Officer Gregory Norwood of the Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department received a call on the morning of March 10, 1994. And once the police gained access to her apartment by the maintenance man, the officers discovered Betty Jean's body, which was fully clothed, face down on her mattress, choked to death with a towel twisted around her neck like a noose. She was stone cold, having been dead for 24 hours. Police also noticed that Betty Jean's apartment had been totally ransacked. Her TV and VCR were missing from the entertainment center. There were wires spread out across the floor as well. A Nissan Pulsar sports car was missing from the parking lot, so police put out an APB, an all-points bulletin on her car. They checked the pawn shops for her property. Approximately an hour after Mr. Ellis called police, an officer approached him in the parking lot of the Bojangles restaurant and told him that Betty Jean Baucom was found dead. They found her body. They immediately alerted all officers to be on the lookout for her car. Again, Dr. Sullivan noticed signs of strangulation and blunt force trauma injuries on Betty Jean's body when he performed her autopsy on March 11, 1994. The ligature consisted of a small sheet and pillowcase in a knot with an additional towel wrapped between the skin of the neck and the sheet. Dr. Sullivan observed small abrasions and small contusions of the skin of the neck beneath the ligature and small hemorrhages in the conjunctiva. In case you are wondering, the conjunctiva is a thin, clear membrane that lines the inside of the eyelid and covers the white part of the eyeball or sclera. It protects and lubricates the eye by producing tears and mucus, and it acts as a barrier between the eye's vulnerable tissue and anything that could irritate them. So basically, Betty Jean Bauckham had bleeding and hemorrhaging in the eye. When she was strangled, it caused the eyes to bulge and the blood vessels in the eyes to burst. Additionally, Dr. Sullivan observed abrasions on the left shoulder, both arms, the right upper chest, and the abdomen, and a blunt trauma injury to the head with an area of abrasions over the right forehead. He eventually testified that the injuries observed were consistent with a struggle. Dr. Sullivan indicated that the cause of Betty Jean Bauckham's death was ligature strangulation again. While still investigating Betty Jean Bauckham's murder, police were summoned to a nearby apartment located within the same apartment complex as Betty Jean Bauckham, the Lake Apartments. The apartment of Burness Woods and Brandy June Henderson, where they lived with their young baby Tyrese, also known as TW. On Wednesday, March 9th of 1994, Burness was taking care of his son, TW, because Brandy was about ready to leave for an appointment with the doctor when she stepped out of the door and encountered Henry Louis Wallace. He told her he was leaving town, and he left after only a few minutes. I wonder why. Brandy returned home around 5 p.m., and this was when her boyfriend, Burness Lamar Woods, departed for work. Their apartment was clean and neat, and the front door was always locked. However, when Mr. Woods returned home from work around midnight to find that the front door was no longer locked, as he entered the apartment, he stumbled into a massive mess, items thrown everywhere throughout the apartment. Seeing this, Mr. Woods rushed to locate his family, found his son, who was actively gasping for air. There was a white item coming out of his mouth. He also had a pair of shorts tied around his neck. Woods then realized that Henderson was lying face down on the bed in the same room. Burness rolled her onto her back and saw that towels were tied around her neck and her face was blue. He removed the towels from around Henderson's neck as well as the short from around his baby. Then he called 911. He then moved Brandy's body from the bed to the floor and began administering CPR as instructed by the 911 operator. When police officers arrived, it was obvious that Henderson was dead. Wallace also stole a Pringles can out of her apartment and that she kept coins in. She was saving money in the Pringles can. When the police arrived, they realized it is the same apartment complex, the Lake Apartments, where Betty Jean Bauckham was just found dead also. They rushed little TW to the Carolinas Medical Center, for doctors feel that his attempted asphyxiation trauma he suffered at the hands of a monster might cause him brain damage. In addition, there was very fine bruising on TW's cheeks and eyelids caused by the buildup of blood pressure as a result of his jugular vein being blocked. Moreover, TW's altered mental status indicated his brain was not functioning normally because of some compromise of blood flow to his brain. Within 15 to 30 minutes, though, TW became more alert and began interacting with his environment. Dr. Brewer testified later that he believed the ligature and TW's injuries caused great pain and suffering to the child, but eventually tests revealed that he was going to be totally fine. Seeing the small baby TW and the applied ligature, detectives could feel their blood boiling at this point. Brandy Henderson's autopsy was no different than the other victims. Evidence of strangulation was apparent. Dr. Sullivan also noted blunt force trauma and lacerations on her body. Her cause of death was ligature strangulation. But what you will find interesting about Brandy is her cousin George Burrell. Sometime earlier, George Burrell, who is Brandy's first cousin, was on the phone with Brandy. Brandy and George share the same birthday, 5 years apart. They also are best friends. She and George saw each other almost every day, particularly after the birth of Tyrese, her son. Being a mother rooted Brandy, George says about her, and brought a greater purpose to her life. Brandy was young, she was small, and Tyrese's baby stroller was more than 2 times bigger than her. You could barely see her as she was pushing the stroller up the hill. All you saw was a stroller coming up the hill. She was that small. George said that was just the funniest thing he had ever seen. Those memories, he says, that's all I have. On the evening of March 9, 1994, between 8 and 9 p.m., George Burrell got a phone call from his cousin Brandy, who lived a 2-minute walk away in the Lake Apartments. She and Burness Squeaky Woods had moved in a month earlier to rent a bigger place for themselves and for their new 9-month-old baby, TW. Over the phone that night, repeatedly begged her cousin George Burrell to drop by. Squeaky would be working until midnight, she told him. She had ordered Chinese takeout, and she had recently bought some new toys for TW that she wanted George to see. Burrell declined to come over, telling her that he was too tired and he had to get up early the next morning to make bread dough during his shift at the Pizza Hut on Milton Road. The cousins went back and forth on the phone until Brandy told him to hold on. Somebody is at the door. And she goes and answers the door. She lets the person in, and George then heard Brandy tell the person, "Lock the door behind you." So George, Brandy's cousin, thought that whoever was at the door was familiar to Brandy. Because Brandy was a shy girl, he didn't feel like anything was wrong. She would only let in someone that she knew. He was awakened by a phone call the next morning. It was his sister, Elisa Foster. George said, "I left the radio on while I was asleep. I woke up and I heard my cousin's voice, Brandy, over the radio." The announcer said. He mentioned her name. "I heard them say Brandy Henderson was murdered last night." There's no way Burrell remembers telling his sister, "I just talked to her." He rushed to his TV. The first thing he saw was a video clip of Brandy's covered body being wheeled away on a gurney. The shock was immediate, George said. Then came the waves of guilt. Would he have saved her if he had dropped by as she had asked? Or would Brandy's killer have killed him too? If I had a chance to talk to her, I'd tell her, "I'm sorry. Sorry that I did not come," Burrell says. "And I would ask her, I need to know this. Were you calling for me? Were you hoping I would change my mind and just show up?" That afternoon, George Burrell left work early and went looking for Squeaky Woods, Burness, Brandy's boyfriend, hoping to learn more about his cousin's killing. He stopped at the apartments of a mutual friend named Kevin to see if Burness was there. When Burrell walked through the front door, he recognized a man on the couch in front of Kevin's big new TV. The man offered to make room next to him, but Burrell just found a spot on the floor and sat down at the man's feet to the left. It was Henry Louis Wallace. Henry puts his hand on George's shoulder and says, "Man, I'm sorry about your cousin Brandy. I know whenever I used to go over there, she would always say, 'Make sure you lock the door behind you.'" George looks up at Wallace and remembers that's exactly what Brandy said the night she was murdered when he was holding on the phone with her. George says to himself, "Is this my cousin's killer?" Wallace quieted the room as police detectives on the TV screen publicly announced for the first time that a serial killer was targeting women in East and West Charlotte. They were putting out a warning to all women, don't let anybody into your house. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department homicide investigator Rich Saunders said during the broadcast, Burrell watched with the others. When he turned and glanced to his right at Henry, a chill shot through him. The eyes of Henry Wallace burned. It was like he had disappeared from where he was at and was off in his own mind. Later, as Brandy's boyfriend discovered his girlfriend and his son on the floor in his apartment, Bernice Lamar Wood would eventually leave Charlotte, driving to Tampa with T.W., his son, to move in with his relatives. The move was so sudden that Woods left Henderson's clothes hanging in the closet. George, her cousin, says it would take years for his side of the family to find Therese, T.W., the small child. The father and son stayed in Florida briefly after that. They moved on to Bernice's hometown in Chicago. There they lived with Bernice and Bernice's grandmother, who had an apartment in the public housing, the project. Bernice would never be the same after the death of Brandy. He died in his sleep at the age of 28, and T.W. was only 5 years old. So because two murders happened at the same apartment complex, the Lake Apartments, that the police finally put two and two together. The police finally realized that they had a serial killer on their hands. It only took the death of 8 women for them to realize it, so the police increased patrols in East Charlotte where the women were found dead. The black community in the area where the murders were taking place began to notice a pattern, and there were claims that law enforcement was not treating each of these cases as importantly as they should have been. To some, it was blatantly obvious that someone out there was getting a kick out of sexually assaulting and strangling women. An emergency press conference was held, and the authorities assured the people that investigation would continue and they would produce results shortly. Then the police put veteran homicide detective Sergeant Gary McFadden, who was newly appointed by the Assistant Chief Bolger only hours before the press conference. And incidentally, Gary McFadden was a black man. Gee, I wonder why. Suddenly found himself in the thick of the battle, although he had not previously been assigned to the strangulation cases. His excellent record, though, had earned him a tough and thankless position. He expressed his sympathy for all those affected and expressed his determination to solve these cases. The community hated him. He confessed in a way he felt like a scapegoat. It was a total conflict, but McFadden, being a professional, did his duty. Because of the unreported communication in the targeted areas, police criticism intensified under fire was a perceived lackadaisical attitude by local politicians and law enforcement. The hunt for the Charlotte Strangler, investigators obviously made the connection between Bockham and Henderson murders. They also started to see similarities in other cases. On March 10, 1994, Commander Gary McFadden was put in place to head up the investigation, and he brought his squad together for a meeting early the next morning to compare notes they had made during their interviews with the deceased women's acquaintances. The results of the reports were enlightened. If they had done this in the beginning, they would have caught him sooner. They indicated that the girls did not seem to know each other, although some had crossed paths and had worked or attended the same schools. The clubs where they socialized were different, but when asked a list of names of people whom each victim associated with, all of the interviewees mentioned in their lists the same one name, and that name was Henry Louis Wallace. Shauna Hawk worked with Henry at the Taco Bell. Vanessa Mack was the sister of Henry's ex-girlfriend, Leslie Little. Betty Jean Baucom was a friend of his current girlfriend, Sadie McKnight, and Brandy Henderson was the girlfriend of Wallace's good friend, Vernice Lamar Woods, who found his girlfriend dead. Later, Mr. Woods would say about Henry he would often visit his girlfriend, usually when he wasn't there. Searching back into the open case of missing person, Caroline Love's detectives now realized that Love had also known Wallace because she had been the roommate of Sadie McKnight, his girlfriend, whom Wallace regularly visited. The puzzle pieces slid into place perfectly. The puzzle started to come together when Sergeant McFadden checks Wallace's criminal history. Sergeant McFadden was surprised to find out that as he searches, an outstanding warrant has already been out for Henry Louis Wallace for having failed to come to court on a recent larceny charge. When the police approach Henry's girlfriend, Sadie McKnight, she is taken aback that her boyfriend, Henry Louis Wallace, might be the Charlotte Strangler. But the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. Henry had often given her presents, and like most serial killer, he kept trophies from his dead victims to remind him of the murders. Henry gave her bracelets, rings, necklaces that suddenly seemed very familiar to Sadie. In retrospect, Sadie knew these girls as well, so probably unknowingly she saw the jewelry before. She just didn't realize where she saw them from. She came to realize later that she was wearing the jewelry of dead women. Then the commander finally came up with irrefutable evidence on March 11, 1994. Police located Betty Jean Baucom's Nissan Pulsar. Her car was located abandoned in the parking lot across from her apartment complex. They dusted for fingerprints, and on the trunk lid of the car was a match to Henry Louis Wallace. They also found a Pringles can in the car that came from Brandy Henderson's apartment. While looking at his mugshot, police realized he was wearing a cross-shaped earring, similarly to the grainy photo of the man who was caught on camera using Vanessa Mack's ATM card was wearing. Their search for Wallace was now in full force. Police staked out Wallace's apartment at the Glen Hollow Apartments on North Sharon Amity Road throughout March 11th and the following day, but Wallace was not apprehended. 2 hours before his arrest, Henry Louis Wallace was watching professional football on TV with some friends in their East Side apartment and talked about leaving Charlotte. His friends had started to worry about Wallace because he had begun wearing the same clothes for days at a time, and he no longer appeared to have a place to live. They suspected that he had become a crack addict. On March 13th of 1994, Wallace told his friends that he wanted to go home to Barnwell, South Carolina. I wonder why. Just before 3 p.m., y'all might not see me no more, Wallace told a friend around that time. By then, Detective Price, a fellow detective, Mark Corwin, had been pulled off investigating the scenes of the recent killings and given one single task: find a former fast food restaurant manager who had come to the city less than 3 years earlier before and seemed to have a lot of female friends around town. At around 5 p.m., officers Gil Alred and Sidney Wright found Wallace hiding in the bathroom of his friend's East Side apartment, not far from where the last 3 killings had taken place. He was arrested on an outstanding warrant for shoplifting a $48 sweater at a nearby Eastland Mall. Officers Gil Alred and Sid Wright tracked him down at the friend's house p.m. on March 13, 1994. He was finally apprehended while investigators were getting ready to interrogate Henry Louis Wallace. The body of Deborah Ann Slaughter had been discovered that afternoon. She was a 35-year-old co-worker and Henry's girlfriend, Sadie McKnight. She also worked at Bojangles. Unfortunately, Deborah's mother, Lovey Slaughter, went to visit her daughter at her apartment on March 12, 1994. Her mother, Lovey Slaughter, arrived at her daughter's apartment to return a picture she had taken a few days prior. Lovey believed her daughter was at work, so she already planned to let herself in. Strangely, when she went to unlock the door, she discovered it wasn't locked. Immediately after entering her daughter's apartment, she saw her lying on the kitchen floor. She was not alarmed at first, seeing Deborah lying on the floor, because Deborah had back problems. She thought she was lying down to relieve her back, until she looked closer and saw that Deborah was dead. Henry Louis Wallace raped, strangled, and stabbed her, get this, 38 times in the stomach and in the chest. Yes, I said it, 38 times. This was a prolonged attack. Do you know how long it takes to stab a person 38 times? Well, let me show you. Just imagine. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Get my point? Henry Louis Wallace had to have a lot of rage to sit there and stab Deborah 38 times. It shows how much of a monster he truly is. Officer Ronnie Chambers of the Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department entered Slaughter's apartment and found a purse with its contents scattered on the floor. Chambers then noticed Slaughter's body laying on the floor, face up. There was white fabric in Slaughter's mouth and a towel around her neck. Slaughter also had multiple puncture wounds on her upper body. Dr. Sullivan, the medical examiner, was the one to perform her autopsy. Like all the others, during the external examination, he observed a ligature around Slaughter's neck and a sock balled up and stuffed into her mouth, holding her mouth open wide. The evidence of the strangulation include ligature around Slaughter's neck, hemorrhaging in the conjunctiva. The ligature was composed of 2 towels. The inner towel made a circle around her neck, and the outer towel tied tightly in a single knot. Additionally, Dr. Sullivan observed sharp trauma injuries caused by 38 stab wounds to the chest and the abdomen. 3 of the stab wounds caused injury to the heart, and 12 of the stab wounds caused injury to the left lung. Each of these stab wounds could have been fatal. Stab wounds also cause injury to the liver and the stomach. Dr. Sullivan determined that Slaughter's death was caused by multiple stab wounds, with ligature strangulation as a contributing factor to her death. This act was more vicious than the others because once he approached Deborah, she realized that she was looking at the Charlotte Strangler, and she fought for her life. No mother should see her daughter in the condition that she was in. After seeing her daughter stabbed 38 times, Mrs. Lovey Slaughter collapsed, and the authorities had to carry her out of the apartment. Slaughter's body was found on March 12, 1994, 4 days after he had murdered Betty and Brandy. So dear old Henry was arrested by detectives Gil Allred and Sid Wright. Wallace was arrested on March 13, 1994. For 12 hours he confessed to the murders of 10 Charlotte women. He then confessed to the 11th, Shonda Bethea, which he committed before moving to Charlotte. Wallace described in detail the women's appearances as well as how he raped, robbed, and killed women. Henry was a central figure in all these women's lives. He was the one who picked up their kids from daycare, who ran errands for them, who were friends of their boyfriends. Henry Louis Wallace should have been the one of the first people interviewed by the police when the girls had turned up dead. Even if they hadn't linked these crimes together, he still should have been the number one suspect to the crimes. He was in their inner circle, so I don't know where the police detectives interviewed, but Henry was not one of them. They took Henry to the LEC, the law enforcement center, and ushered him into the interrogation room. The investigators asked Henry if he knew why he was there. Henry just alluded to the larceny charge. The first sessions of what would be an all-night interrogation yielded little. Wallace was the main suspect, but Detective Price realized police did not have enough evidence to charge him with murder. But Detectives Price and Corwin began their questioning shortly before 7 p.m., talking to Wallace about sports, his jobs, and his family and friends. At 10 o'clock, the detectives read Wallace his Miranda rights and began to apply pressure. "Why," they asked Wallace, "is your handprint on the back of Betty Jean Bachman's car? Why does the man seen in this ATM photo with Vanessa Mack's ATM card have an earring with a dangling cross just like the one in your arrest photo from earlier that day?" Wallace kept deflecting. The back and forth dragged on for 6 more hours. "Don't you think it's funny that so many people around you are dying of unnatural causes?" Detective Price said. Wallace responded, "That happens to everybody. Hasn't it happened to you?" At one point, Wallace mentioned that he knew Detective Tony Rice from the investigation into the 1992 disappearance of Caroline Love, the roommate of Wallace's girlfriend Sadie McKnight. A call went out at 5 a.m. Detective Rice entered the room. Rice, who had not worked the Wallace case up to that point, but when Detective Rice entered the room, he sat down with Henry and he looked at Henry and said, "Do you mind if I say a prayer?" Henry agreed to have him pray, and he asked all those present, all the detectives present, to bow their heads. While holding Wallace's left hand, the detective led a prayer about thanks, repentance, guidance, and forgiveness. And Wallace began to cry. Detective Rice told Wallace it was time to cleanse his soul, to tell the truth, no matter what the truth may be. After the amens, Wallace sighed, and he said, "Let's do it this way." He said, reaching for a pen and pad. Then Wallace began jotting down names. The detectives expected the list to begin and end with 4 killings over the last 3 weeks. But Wallace kept writing. The officers were stunned, for they suspected Wallace of the last 4 murders, but it turned out to be 11. Wallace has also used a question mark to account for his first Charlotte victim, the only one he did not know, Sharon Nance, 32-year-old Sharon Nance, who was found beaten to death in June of 1992 near Roswell's Ferry Road. During 10 hours of taped confession, Wallace casually shared details how some of the victims fought, scratched, or bit him, while others wept and asked for mercy. One fell to her knees and prayed. He raped and killed them anyway. Wallace considered all these women his friends. He told detectives that their ghosts spoke to him in his dream. After raping them, Wallace said he would give the women the impression that they were safe, only to strangle them with a piece of their own clothing, a towel, a pillowcase. He was playing God. Detective Gary McFadden was outside the interrogation room when one of his colleagues exited with Wallace's list, and the investigator said, "He's got names that we don't have." Wallace was then asked if he would agree to a taping of his confession. Wallace agreed, and this is what he said. Speaking into a recording microphone, Wallace took the detectives through many hours of sickening details. He verbally brought them from one murder scene to the other, describing his thoughts, what the women said, and the agony they endured. When he described their agony, when he applied what he called the Boston choke to render them powerless. Though he robbed most of his victims, and the underlying issue for Henry was the sexual assault, he fulfilled his sensual lusts through power and control. The thefts funded his crack habit, but sex was his primary motive. Eventually, after he moved to Charlotte, he had been fired from one job to the other, and the only way he knew how to get money was to rob his so-called friends. But robbing the women proved more of a practical reason to his ultimate desire, sex. At one point, an investigator told him, "You don't seem like a bad guy," and they thought, "Are you a schizophrenic?" Henry looked at the detective and said,
There's the good in me and the bad in me. And as the years progressed, the bad in me took over. So I felt invincible.
Wallace's words were chilling. In March of 1990, Henry had a crush on Tashonda Bethea. Both of their mothers worked at the same factory, and they were friends, which is how they met. Wallace quickly developed a crush on her after they met, although the feelings weren't exactly mutual. Bethea would accept rides from him sometimes, but continually resisted his advances. Henry would describe, saying that they kissed and hugged, but she would never let it go any farther than that. "I believe that Tashonda was a virgin," he said. But in Henry's mind, he felt like Tashonda was using him for his rise, and over time it built up an anger inside of him, and eventually that anger has to go somewhere, he said. Tashonda was 18 and Henry was 25. She was an 18-year-old Barnwell High School student. One day he saw Tashonda walking by herself. He picked her up in his car and took her out to the city limits. He took her out into the woods. He exited his car, went to his trunk, and pulled out a .357. He went to the passenger side of the car and told her to get out of the car. She did what he said. He told her to take off her clothes, so she complied, seeing the gun. Then he proceeded to rape her on the hood of his car. In his mind, he deserved this. She should have given him sex when he asked her. Wallace asked Tashonda was she going to tell, and at first she said yes, and then quickly said no. She promised she wouldn't tell. Wallace didn't believe her.
I grabbed her by her neck. I could hear her gasping for air. And I knew that it was going to happen, but I couldn't prevent it from happening. That's where the switch was flipped, and I just started choking, and just choking and choking and choking, and she passed out. Put her into the backseat of the car. We drove further out of town and headed up.
He drove to a place called Henderson Pond, about 6 miles away from Barnwell. He had a box cutter in his trunk, and he used it to cut Tashonda's throat and her wrists. She was gasping for air, and he grabbed the woman he had a crush on, rolling her into the water. Wallace claims that he saw bubbles rising to the surface after she sank under the water. She sunk in the pond pretty quick, Wallace said. She was struggling, and he stood there and watched. He stood there and watched as the bubbles from her being in the pond floated to the surface. The bubbles stopped, and she was dead. A few days later, police had 3 or 4 names of people she was seen with that day, but Wallace quickly became the top suspect. Investigators combed through his car, but any evidence to link him to her disappearance, but found nothing. Wallace had thoroughly cleaned his car. Days earlier, Wallace was not very cooperative with the police. He didn't offer any new information. They didn't have enough evidence to charge him, so they had to let him go. It turned out Caroline's roommate, as we know, was Sadie McKnight, who was Henry Louis Wallace's girlfriend.
Caroline, I met her through my cousin Sadie. You were dating Sadie McKnight at the time? Yeah.
He took a key from the apartment of his girlfriend Sadie McKnight when he knew that no one would be there. He went into the apartment and hid in the bathroom. After hearing Caroline enter the apartment, he called out to her from the bathroom, letting her know that he was about to leave. But instead of leaving, however, he went into the living room where
she was sitting on the sofa. I bent down behind the sofa and I kissed her on the cheek. I can't remember if I used my hands or if I used another object to strangle her to death.
Caroline was watching TV and he kissed her on the cheek. Caroline promised not to tell his girlfriend Sadie as long as it didn't happen again. Wallace told Caroline that he wanted to make love. When she resisted, he put her in the wrestling move, which Wallace called the Boston Choke. He maintained the hold on love, and she struggled to get free. She scratched him on his arms and his face, trying to desperately get out of his grasp. Henry said, "I kept the hold on her until she passed out," and Wallace brought her to her bedroom and proceeded to undress her and sexually assault her. She began to regain consciousness during the assault at the same time. He said he was still holding the choke move on her, and she began to fight him. So he looked over and saw a curling iron, and he used the cord from the curling iron around her neck. He strangled her. After she died, he left the apartment to move his car closer to the stairwell and then returned to the apartment with a large orange trash bag. I tied her body up in her bed sheets and placed her in the large orange trash bag, the kind the city workers use. He then put some of her clothing in a separate trash bag, hopeful to make it look like she left on her own. Henry carried the bags down the stairs, placed the dead weight in the back seat of his car. Returning to the apartment, he grabbed a roll of quarters he saw on the dresser, the roll of quarters that she got from a manager to do her laundry, and he drove around Charlotte trying to find a place to dump Caroline's body. Henry stopped the car while driving down Statesville Road, removed the trash bag containing Love's body from his car, and dumped the bag in the woods. After 2 days, Henry drove back to the location because he feared that the orange bag would be noticeable from the road. Henry stated that he removed the body from the orange trash bag and then moved the body near the city limits, passing some construction barriers, and dumped the body into a shallow ravine. She was decomposing at that point, he said. It looked like leather or an E.T. doll, describing her body. Wallace was worried that it might stick out and be seen from the road. He then took her body to that ravine and dumped it there, near Charlotte city limits. He went back to her body a second time, and there was only bones left. He said, "I guess the animals got to her." Now get this, dear old Henry, Sadie's loving boyfriend, actually goes with Kathy Love, Caroline's sister, and Sadie McKnight in order to report Caroline as a missing person to the police when she first disappeared. "I had no intention of killing Shauna," he said, but merely talking to her. She just had come from home from school and her mother wasn't there. The two shared some idle gossip. She started teasing me about a fight I had with my girlfriend Sadie. This pissed him off. He placed her in the chokehold, took her to the bedroom, told her to remove her clothing, and told her to perform oral sex on him, which she did. Then Henry performed oral sex on her. He then sexually assaulted Shauna, admitting that Hawk was afraid and cried the whole time. Afterwards, Henry told Shauna to put her clothes on, and he took her into the downstairs bathroom.
We went to the bathroom, and that's when I administered the chokehold on her, and I submerged her and held her down under the water until she was dead.
Where he put the choke on her until she died, and then placed her body into the bathtub, which was full of water. He also admitted to stealing $50 from her purse. He betrayed Miss D. Sumter, her mother, even further. Henry Louis Wallace had the nerve to attend Shauna's funeral like nothing happened, and even consoled her mother after Shauna's death.
The thing that makes my blood run cold and just send shock shivers up and down my spine is the fact that I saw him after Shauna was murdered, and he expressed his condolences, and he told me how sorry he was. He knew he had killed her.
Shauna's family and her godmother would eventually form an organization, the organization dedicated to parents of murder victims, and is still going strong to this day. The organization arranges vigils, funerals, offers counseling for parents and loved ones of murdered victims. Shauna's nickname was the Purple Princess because her favorite color was purple, a favorite of royalty, and she was adopted of mothers of murder offering to represent nonviolence. Audrey had just come home from being on vacation. Wallace went by her home and they smoked marijuana together. He had another reason for being there, which was robbery. After he finished smoking the marijuana, Henry demanded to know how much money she had in her apartment. He took what she had available. Wallace proceeded to put Spain into the chokehold while they were in the living room. While she was being held between his arms, Wallace demanded her bank account information and balance, but all Spain could do was beg him not to hurt her. Ignoring her pleas, Wallace continued to hold Spain until she was unconscious. She began to black out. He dragged her into the back bedroom and raped her. She regained consciousness and she begged him not to hurt her. He raped her again and then told her to stand up and put on her clothes. As she stood up to put on her clothes, he placed a chokehold on her again, constructed a ligature out of the t-shirt and bra, and placed it around her neck like a garrote, strangling her. He then dragged her body into the bathroom where he washed her. He washed her off, trying to get rid of any evidence he may have left behind during the attack. Wallace placed her into her bed and tied a t-shirt and bra around her neck upon leaving to make sure she was dead. He saw her keys, her Visa, MasterCard, and Exxon card, and I used the card later for gas, he said. And then he returned to her apartment to make phone calls to make it seem like she was still alive. Wallace indicated the jumper was like a sister to him. If that's the way you treat a sister, how does he treat his enemies? And that they often spent time with one another. On the night in question, Henry said he stopped by Jumper's apartment and that he talked for a while. I don't know why I hurt her, he said. After they talked for a while, I asked her to please call Sadie to let her know that I was there so she wouldn't wonder where I was at. When she turned to dial the number, I threw her in the chokehold. She begged me not to hurt her. She said, I'll do anything that you want, just don't hurt me. Fearfully, she allowed him to feel her up. She even performed oral sex on him, hoping that would save her life. While she was getting dressed afterwards, I managed to draw her attention to the other side of the room. Then I put the towel around her neck. Valencia started bleeding from her nose, so he kept the pressure on the towel for about 5 minutes until he felt no pulse. Then Wallace wiped his fingerprints from certain areas of her apartment. I went to the kitchen and I noticed there was a bottle of rum 151, and I poured the rum all over her body, on the bed and on the floor nearby. I went to the kitchen. I opened a can of pork and beans. I put it on the stove. I took the battery out of the smoke detector, and then I turned the stove on high. Then I went back to her bedroom. I took a match and I threw it on her body, and I left and went home. Before I set the fire to her body, I removed some expensive pieces of jewelry so I could pawn them later. Like in previous crimes, he had the nerve to return to the scene of the crime, her apartment, 20 minutes later. When he saw smoke rushing out of her door, he left and went home. Vanessa Jumper never believed that her younger sister, Valencia, would have failed to turn off the stove before falling asleep. But law enforcement officials told Valencia Jumper's family that summer in 1993 that she died of thermal burns during a fire in her home in Greenbrier Apartments off Sharon Amity Road. Eventually, Vanessa Jumper found out she was right. Grieving is bad enough. Now 7 months later, it's hitting just as hard as when they first called. 3 days later, after he murdered Valencia, Wallace and his sister Yvonne go to Valencia's funeral and gives her family condolences. With the intention of raping and murdering her, Wallace went to see Michelle Stetson. Wallace dropped in unannounced at about 11 p.m. His sole aim, he said, was to rape, sitting and chatting with her for a while. Then Henry got ready to leave and they hugged. At that point, Henry told Stetson that he wanted to have sex with her and he wanted her to remove her clothes. Michelle told Wallace that she was sick, but he did not believe her and wanted her to produce some sort of medication, which she could not do. He began to choke her. Stetson then agreed to have sex with Henry and removed her clothes. Wallace told Michelle he wanted her to perform oral sex on him, but she said she did not know how. Wallace responded, "Well, you're about to learn." Stetson then performed oral sex on Henry Louis Wallace. He forced her to have sex and then he choked her until she passed out. He said he went to the bathroom. He got a towel and put it around her neck, and I strangled her, he said. But she kept moaning and groaning, so forth and so on, so there was a knife in the kitchen. I think I stabbed her about 4 times. He used a washcloth to wipe his fingerprints from a glass, the door, the phone, the wall, and the floor. Before Wallace left Michelle's apartment, her oldest son woke up and he told him to go back to bed. Wallace left through the back door using a towel to avoid leaving fingerprints and threw the knife and the washcloth over the fence near the back of Stetson's building. When Dr. Sullivan performed his autopsy on Michelle Stetson's body, it was September the 16th, 1993. He discovered 4 stab wounds to the left side of her back. 2 of the 4 stab wounds caused injury to the heart and lungs and were potentially fatal. Dr. Sullivan also observed evidence of ligature strangulation in the form of a band of abrasions and contusions over the front of her neck and small hemorrhages in the skin of the face, the conjunctiva, and internally in the muscles of Stenson's neck. Dr. Sullivan listed that the cause of her death were the stab wounds with ligature strangulation as a contributing factor. Henry became friends with Michelle during his time as a manager at the Taco Bell. Wallace's next victim, Vanessa Mack, would be 1 year later after he had murdered Shauna Hawk. Henry knew Vanessa when he dated her sister, Leslie Little. By the time he killed Vanessa, his primary motive was money. Wallace was a drug addict, and he did anything he could to get his hands on money. And Vanessa had a good job, money in the bank, and always carried an ATM card. Tonight he carried a pillowcase hidden under his jacket. Henry was in Vanessa's neighborhood and called to see if she was at home. When she answered, he hung up the phone. He then walked over to her apartment. If she had just ignored that call, she might still be alive. Henry tried to find a way to maneuver Mack into the position he needed in order to administer what he called the Boston choke, but she refused to give him a hug, so he asked for something to drink. When she turned her back, Henry pulled out the pillowcase he had brought with him and placed it around her neck. As Mack resisted, Henry put more pressure on the pillowcase and explained that this was a robbery. She told me she had just gotten her income tax check. Wallace and Mack went into the bedroom where he commanded Vanessa all the money she had, including her ATM card and the PIN number. After Mack gave Henry everything, he told her to remove her clothes, which she did. He raped her. She was too afraid to object to him. When they were through, she mentioned that she needed to put her baby to bed, the baby that was on the couch. Henry said he remembered that she had a 4-month-old baby lying out on the sofa. He pretended to release her from his grasp, but as soon as she rose up off the mattress, he reached around her once more with the pillowcase and ended her life. Wallace then checked on Mack's baby and stayed until the baby went to sleep. So he sat in her apartment with her dead body, watching over her daughter until the child fell asleep. What arrogance to sit inside the apartment after you just murdered someone. He left the apartment, walked down the street, and called a cab later that evening. While at the ATM and using her ATM card, it did not work. Vanessa gave him the wrong PIN number. He got everything else. He wasn't going to get her money too. Then he goes to Betty Jean Bachum's apartment. I figured since Betty Jean was one of the supervisors at the Bojangles, she had the code to the burglar alarm and possessed keys to the safe, he thought. He asked her, could he use her phone? And when she agreed, he walked over to her phone and pretended like he was looking for a number to just delay. They spoke for a while. When she turned her back, he subdued her. He asked her for the combination to the safe. Bachum was very upset, and she took approximately 30 minutes to finally produce the safe's combination. Henry then released the chokehold. Henry remembered Bachum asking, "Why did you do that to me?" He responded that he was a sick person and they had hurt many people. Bachum said she forgave him and told him that he needed help. Henry became enraged by this and grabbed Bachum by the throat, slammed her to the floor, and then fought with her. Henry regained control and got Bachum to her feet and took her into the bedroom where he told her to remove her clothes. When he wanted her to take off her clothes, she resisted And she said because she told him that she had a medical problem. She then showed Henry a rash, which Henry stated looked like an ordinary rash. Wallace then told Bacham he wanted her to perform oral sex on him. She grabbed his groin and started pulling and scratching. Henry and Bacham began to fight again. Fighting, she inflicted scratches and a bite mark on his shoulder and scratches on his abdomen. Wallace was able to tighten the towel around Bacham's neck until she was nearly unconscious. At this point, Bacham removed her clothes. He angrily raped her. Afterwards, Henry told Betty Jean to put her clothes back on. He then placed a towel around her neck. He strangled Betty Jean Bacham to death after that. Henry took her television and left in her car. Wallace sold the television for drugs. He then returned to Bacham's apartment to make sure that she was dead and to take her VCR. While in Bacham's apartment, Wallace used a wet cloth to wipe off the phone, the doorknobs, and the wall on which some of the struggle took place. Henry took money from Bacham's purse, her gold chain from around her neck, and the VCR to purchase more drugs. He kept Bacham's car almost 2 days. Then he walked down the hall to the apartment of Brandy Henderson. Wallace confessed that he had planned to murder Brandy that morning, but Bernice Lamar Woods, her boyfriend, was present at the apartment, which threw off his plans. So he left Henderson's apartment and walked down to Betty Jean Bacham's apartment in the same complex. He then went on to murder Betty Jean and circled back around to Brandy Henderson's apartment later the same night when he knew her boyfriend would be gone and that her 10-month-old baby would be there.
I knocked at the door to Brandy.
So he knocked on the door and tells Brandy, "Oh, I have something for Lamar." Brandy and Henry talked for a while, and then he asked her for something to drink. When Brandy reached into the cabinet, Henry choked her and told her to go into the bedroom. He demanded money. She only had $15 in her purse. She gave it to him, but she also had some coins and a Pringles can that she was saving. It was approximately $20 worth of coins, and said there was no other money in the house, she told him. He also told Brandy he would be taking the television and the stereo when he left. Henry then told Brandy to remove her clothes, which she did. When Henry was raping Brandy, her son started to cry. Brandy asked Henry, could she hold her son? And he said no at first, but the baby continued to cry. So Henry relented and let her hold her son while he was raping her. Henderson grabbed her son, laid him across her chest, and turned his head away so he could not see what was going on. Henry sexually assaulted Brandy in Henderson's bedroom, but moved to the baby's bedroom so he would not cry. Once in TW's room, Henry and Brandy continued to have sex, with TW lying across her chest. This assault tells you everything you need to know about Henry Louis Wallace. He's dead inside, diabolical, clearly a man with no conscience. After he finished, she got up on her knees and started praying, and because she was so scared, he said, "Oh, I'm not going to hurt you." Afterwards, Henry told Henderson to put her clothes back on, and he puts his clothes on as well. He went into the bathroom, got a towel, and wiped off everything. He asked Brandy for a hug, so she hugged him.
I went to the bathroom and got the towel. I folded the towel up again. I put it around her neck. And then I spread her back.
And he choked her with the towel while she was in his arms until she was red in the face, and he strangled her to death. Henderson's body fell to the floor. Henry picked up Henderson's body and put it onto T.W.'s bed. He also tied the towel in a knot around her neck. T.W. started to cry again. So he gave him a pacifier, but he continued to cry. He wouldn't stop crying. Henry looked around for something T.W. could drink, but could not find anything. He then took his shorts and tied it around his neck, around the baby's neck, so it would be difficult for him to breathe, so he would stop crying, because he didn't want to leave the baby crying and neighbors wake up and see him leaving her apartment. The baby stopped crying and laid down next to his mother's body. Henry took a television that was sitting on the floor. Before leaving, Wallace took some of the food that had been delivered and the Pringles can of coins. He stole items from their house and added them to the items he had taken from Betty Jean Bockham's house, which were still sitting in Bockham's car. He sold both Brandy and Betty Jean's belongings. He kept her car for nearly 2 days, but grew anxious that the police were following him, so he ultimately left the car in a parking lot in a shopping center across from the Lake Apartments where Brandy and Betty Jean lived. He wiped his fingerprints off everything he touched in the car, but he forgot to wipe off his palm print on the back trunk lid of Betty Jean Bockham's car. 4 days later, Henry visited Deborah Ann Slaughter at the Glen Hollow Apartments, the same apartment complex Henry lived in. He visited Deborah Ann Slaughter, which is also the same complex of Audrey Spain, where Audrey Spain lived at. During the same time Wallace was being arrested, authorities discovered the body of Deborah Ann Slaughter. She was Henry's girlfriend's co-worker at Bojangles. He asked her if she wanted to go half with him on a purchase of cocaine, but Deborah Ann told him that she was unable to buy any drugs because her money had to last until the next week. Henry asked Deborah to get him something to drink. As Deborah turned around, Henry put a towel he brought with him around Deborah's neck and tightened it. Slaughter fell to her knees. Wallace said that Deborah realized at that moment that he was the perpetrator of the previous 2 murders that had happened at the nearby Lake Apartments, the one for Brandy and Betty Jean. Henry said, "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not the Charlotte Strangler." But she only became more angry. She broke free and screamed, "Police! Police!" She was angry and yelled, telling him she started to fight him. Henry regained control and told Deborah to remove her clothes and to perform oral sex on him. Deborah said, "I don't do that. You might as well go ahead and kill me." Henry tightened the towel and asked if she wanted to change her mind, and Deborah stated she held to her conviction that she would not perform oral sex on him. Henry sexually assaulted Deborah. Afterwards, he told her to put on her clothes. Henry, knowing Slaughter carried a knife in her purse at all times, asked her to empty the contents of her purse onto the floor, which she did. Wallace kicked away the knife and then told Slaughter to open the wallet and give him everything in it. As Slaughter did this, Henry grabbed the knife. Slaughter handed him $40 from her wallet, but Deborah hit him and screamed for the police again. But Slaughter proved to be more of a fighter than the other women. Tall and strong, she fought for her life. Henry grabbed her and was able to tighten the towel around her neck until she fell to the floor and started kicking. Henry tightened the towel more and tried to sit on top of Slaughter's legs to keep Slaughter from kicking the floor and alerting the downstairs neighbors of the attack. He stabbed Deborah in the stomach and in the chest with her own dagger, which was a short, pointy little knife. He stabbed her 38 times. After he killed her, Henry then washed the knife, cleaned and wiped his fingerprints from it, and placed it back with the contents of Deborah's purse on the floor. Henry then left her apartment to purchase crack cocaine. And he had the nerve to come back to her apartment, went into the bathroom while poor Deborah's dead body was still on the kitchen floor. When he left the second time, Henry took a coat, a baseball hat, and a butcher's knife from Slaughter's apartment. He threw all 3 items away after leaving the apartment. Wallace also admitted to having slain a prostitute whose name he could not remember back in 1992. We later find out that this is Sharon Ness, but said in that case that the prostitute, Sharon, was the aggressor. He had sex with her, but then she demanded the money for services rendered. He told her he didn't have any money, so she began to fight him. So he beat her to death. Henry Louis Wallace beat Sharon Ann to death with a rock and left her body near the railroad tracks. There he dumped her body out of sight. The confession phase now over, having ended, Detective Saunders asked Henry, "Why have you told us all this?" And Henry said, "I wanted to tell my story a long time. If I hadn't told you, I wouldn't have stopped killing. I would have continued, and I probably would have killed myself eventually." Later, on the 13th of March, 1994, after Henry's confession, he directed Detective Rice and other investigators to the site where he had dumped Caroline Love's body. Subsequently, Dr. James Michael Sullivan, the forensic pathologist and medical examiner, went to the area of Statesville Road to recover Caroline Love's skeletal remains. On April 4, 1994, Wallace was officially indicted for 9 counts of murder as well as a slew of other charges: first and second degree rape, first and second degree sexual offense, assault with a deadly weapon, assault of a child under 12 years old. There was a counselor that evaluated Henry for the defense and said his childhood is where his problems stem from. From a dysfunctional upbringing, he kept all his rage within. As he grew older, Wallace even dated other women, though. Still pining for Moretta, though, his wife, he impregnated another woman, and even though the relationship did not last, Wallace was the proud father of a baby girl. She was born on September of 1993, and despite spiraling out of control, the child, Kendra Urella, remains the treasure, the only bright spot in his life. But his failures were mowing him down. Having experimented with drugs as a minor, he now turned to them for an escape. From the memories of Moretta, whom he still loved, his drug habits increased. Jobs he took at Taco Bell and other places did not last simply because he did not care enough. By this time, he was dead inside. There was a devil twitching inside him, a bad recollection of unfulfilled dreams. Henry Louis Wallace finally gave in to the devil and created a piece of hell on earth for 10 Charlotte women and their families. For 2 years, Wallace's trial would be delayed due to the choice of venue, DNA evidence collected from the crime scenes, and jury selection. Wallace's trial finally took place in Mecklenburg County Superior Courthouse. It lasted nearly 4 months. Court convened on September of 1996 and concluded late January of 1997. The trial began. The prosecution was seeking the death penalty, while the defense was asking for a life sentence. Wallace did not testify at his trial, but his team presented evidence from 3 expert witnesses. The defense argued that Wallace was mentally ill and was unable to form the specific intent necessary to commit first-degree murder. They argued that the murders did not result from a premeditation and deliberation. His childhood abuse was also brought out in court. Psychologist Faye Sultan testified that Wallace had been a victim of physical and mental abuse at the hands of his mother since birth, and that he had a mental illness at the time of the killings. His defense argued for a life sentence without parole instead of the death penalty. And on January 7, 1997, the jury disagreed and found Wallace guilty of 9 counts of first-degree murder. The judgment was death for all 9 murders. During the conclusion of the trial, Wallace gave a written response. In this statement, while he conceded to the horror he created, but he asked the families for their forgiveness. Quoting the book of Mark, he said, book of Mark in the Bible, he said, "When you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, then your Father also, which is in heaven, will forgive you of your trespasses." Wallace was sent to death row in Raleigh, North Carolina. Henry Louis Wallace has made appeals to overturn his death sentences, making claims that his confessions were coerced, you're right, and that his constitutional rights were violated in the process. The North Carolina Supreme Court upheld his sentences. In 2000, his appeals to have his sentences overturned have since been rejected. Henry Louis Wallace is currently awaiting execution at the Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. One last surprise for Henry Louis Wallace. He married his prison nurse, Rebecca Trollius, on June 5, 1998, the vows being exchanged in a small room next to the death chamber. Although they were never allowed to consummate their marriage, the couple remains in communication. His wife is a constant visitor, but the memory of his wedding day almost assuredly lightens the daily load, and by chance he glances down the corridor. Instead of seeing the death chamber, he will remember where he got married. We can see from the life of Henry Louis Wallace that he was not born a serial killer, but that he was raised to be one from years of neglect and abuse. We can see the pivotal role that a mother and a father play in a child's life. Just look at Henry. From a small age, Henry learned how to hold in his rage, how to be bitter, how not to forgive. It made him view women as things, not as people. He learned how to charm his way through life, and clearly Henry had no conscience until he finally exploded at key moments. Henry Louis Wallace helps us to understand that hurt people will hurt people. But even though Henry's childhood was horrible, that's no excuse for what he did, because when it's all said and done, we have a choice to say no. Henry knew exactly what he was doing. That's why he took such elaborate levels to hide his crime, and for them to say that his acts were not premeditated. But he circled back around to go kill Brandy Henderson, which means he considered it, thought it out, and went back later to fulfill his murder. Henry Louis Wallace had a grandiose sense of identity, a sense of entitlement. He played God with many people's lives. Henry thought he was smarter than everyone else. Most narcissists do. Like most serial killers, he learned how to cover his tracks well. He knew that the police indifference in certain neighborhoods, namely black ones, would give him the freedom to kill whenever he wanted. He toyed with the police, altering crime scenes, turning down thermostats, moving dead bodies, starting fires, but that is no excuse why the police couldn't catch him. Now consider this. If Henry Louis Wallace hadn't killed Brandy Henderson and Betty Jean Bauckham in the same night, in the same apartment complex, we would probably have 20 victims instead of the 11th. Because the police didn't draw any conclusions that these were serial murderers until Henry Wallace killed these two women in the same night. But they still insist that they did a stand-up job in investigating these crimes. If anybody thinks that the police investigating these crimes were not racially motivated, they're not paying attention.
The only time that the police were concerned when the two murders occurred on the same day. That's when Bauckham and Henderson. Same day. That's when all of a sudden they started seeing connections and things that happened 20 months ago.
For if they had followed Homicide 101, they would have found Henry sooner than they did. Clearly, they did not check acquaintances, co-workers, or people in their inner circle, because if they did, they would have found Henry Louis Wallace. Unfortunately, 11 Charlotte women paid the price for their negligence. These women are not prostitutes. These women were not drug addicts. But even if they had been, they don't deserve to be murdered. No one does. They were hardworking mothers trying to make it in life, trying to get a better education in order to bless their families. I'd rather spend time focusing on their lives than on the murderer so much. Let's never forget the price these women paid for being friends with Henry Louis Wallace. To Tashonda, Sharon, Caroline, Shauna, Audrey, Valencia, Michelle, Vanessa, Betty Jean, Brandy, and last but not least, Deborah. Gone but never forgotten, they live on in the lives of the people that love them. This concludes the life of Henry Louis Wallace. This is Notorious Minds, and I am M.R. Parks. Please like and share, and by all means subscribe to this channel. Remember to click the notification bell so that you will be notified the next time I upload a future video. Take care of yourselves. Be safe out there. See you next time.
Within this shell, there are two people. One person being a chameleon. He will adapt to anything, any environment, any situation. And he's a very well respected, very well liked person. He almost lures the women in